Hi everybody and welcome to our annual survey launch. Obviously normally we'd be doing this face to face, somewhere glamorous, but we're all getting used to our online world now. So we've had a great uptake today, so more than actually probably would do if we were doing it physically. So we had over 300 people sign up today, so obviously lots of great interest in what's happening in the market. I'll quite shortly hand over to Tristram, our Chief Research Officer, who will take you through the detail of the survey. But I just wanted to do a couple of things, was just kind of, I guess, give some of my thoughts on actually where we're at the moment, but also just tell you a little bit about how our webinars work if you haven't logged on to one before. You'll find it all, we don't turn people's microphones on because obviously when you've got hundreds of people online, it will be very difficult to manage, but there is a questions box as part of this platform we use, so please do pop your questions into there as we go through. We really do want to hear your questions and engage with you, because I'm sure there's lots of things that you want to know about that maybe we don't have time to cover in the slide deck. So if you pop those questions in there as we go along, I'll keep an eye on them, and what I will do is save them to the end. We've got time at the end, and Tristram and I will work through those. I'm not going to steal Tristram's thunder on the survey, but it was quite interesting sort of reading it through its various drafting stages. There are some similarities, that I recognise with the financial crash. Public sector relatively buoyant, sort of professional services sector staying relatively stable, but then some big drops in areas like retail. So there are some similarities, but also, of course, we are in a very different world to where we were 10 years ago. Being in lockdown, having to do recruitment virtually, having to do attraction virtually is obviously changing very much the way that we all go about our day-to-day work, and we will dive into some of that stuff. We've, as always, got a really good response from the national media to our survey for an organisation that is, relatively small, like the ISE. We do punch above our weight with this. I think we were top of the Guardian's homepage this morning with this story, and we're very conscious that we do need to get the balance right, because it is a difficult recruitment market we're in. Overall there are fewer vacancies, but also we have to recognise that there's still a lot of recruitment activity out there. By far the majority of hiring numbers are carrying over year to year, so we have to be really careful that we don't get the message out to students that the market's dead, so they don't apply, because as Tristram will show, there are still areas that struggle for vacancies. Again, going back to the financial crash, we found that employers didn't fill all their vacancies because students almost, they were the worst into the market, thought there were no vacancies at all. So we do need to get that balance right and recognise there are still lots of opportunities out there. But also we can't be blasé about the lived experience of students. There are lots of students going through a very difficult time, having real challenges in the job market, and real difficulties in getting the right levels of experience, building those CVs up, and just understanding what's happening. So this really is part of our efforts to give as much insight to all our stakeholders, both employers, those in education, those in the suppliers intermediary markets, of what's actually happening on the ground. So as I said, if you've got any questions, please do chuck them into the dialogue box. We will save time for those at the end. A final thank you to all of those employers who did give us their data. It's a cliche, but we couldn't do without you. For a members survey to get well over 2/3 of members actually responding to a survey, is very unusual in terms of response rate. So we really do appreciate the time that the employers take to put into giving us their data. It's what the survey is all about. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to turn my camera off for a bit. I'll come back when we've got some questions at the end. And Tristram, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully people can now see the slides on the screen. So I'm gonna just take you through some of the kind of key findings of the survey this year, and just try and talk through them a bit. Obviously there's a lot more detail available to members in the survey itself. We'll probably be doing more analysis as we go through the year. We tend to find that there's even more in the data, but I've gone quite a long way this year, so we'll get into it and talk about what we're finding so far. So obviously 2020 has been a pretty unusual year It's been a pretty big challenge for many graduates, for many students trying to get into the labour market, but also, of course, for employers trying to manage this process. So in this survey, we're going to go through and really try and reflect a bit on where graduate and student employment has got to, and how the recruitment processes that people are using have changed. So the survey was open through the month of September. We did it slightly later than we normally do. We will often run it in sort of July and August. This year we wanted to really get to the end of the sort of recruitment season for many of those firms that are running recruitment sort of along with the academic year. We thought we wanted to get to the end of that so that people really knew where they'd got to. And that's partly because we did quite a lot of surveying of members back in the spring and early summer, and really to look at how they were reacting to COVID. And we wanted to make sure this was the kind of final picture for 2019-20. It asked 76 questions to people, and hopefully gives people a pretty good opportunity to explain what their recruitment processes look like. There are 179 members who responded to this, and overall, of those who are able to give sort of detailed numbers, we think this is sort of around about 46,000 student hires. This survey describes the experience of. So that's around about 6% of all young people who entered the labour market during last year. So it's a pretty big sample, but one of the things we're always keen to remind people is that the ISE membership is not the sort of typical labour market. It tends to be the upper end of the labour market. So it's larger employers, it's employers who are offering sort of good quality entry routes. So particularly the graduate schemes, apprenticeships, formal school leaver programs, internships, and so on. So it tends to be, those kinds of employers rather than just every job that a young person might go into. But I think it still gives us some really good insights as to what's happening in the labour market, both kind of absolutely and relatively. So this is what we're going to try and cover today. So let's start by thinking a little bit about strategy. So one of the most sort of important things I think is thinking about how graduate recruitment and student recruitment is resourced. One of the things that we need to always remind people is that this stuff doesn't happen by magic. If you're gonna recruit lots of young people, you need people there to do it. There needs to be some kind of team and budget in order to do that. So our typical response looked something like this. So there was probably about 4 people in the student recruitment team. Each of those people were recruiting around 20 student hires. They were aiming to recruit around 20 student hires, and they probably had a budget of around about £200,000 to do it. And that works out at something like a budget of £2,778 per hire was being spent. So this is sort of typical. Now there's a lot of variety in this, and if you get into the report, you've got a lot more detail on that. But this might give people a sort of idea of what the typical ISE recruiter looks like. Now, one of the things we're interested in, particularly in this year, is how our members are responding to various different policy initiatives. And there's been a lot of new policies that have come out since the pandemic, and one of the most important ones was the Plan for Jobs and the Kickstart scheme, but only about 11% of our members were engaging with the Kickstart scheme. We also asked about how many people were sponsoring international students for Tier 2 visas. Quite a high proportion, but around about 39% were, but people were really unsure about how many international students they were going to be sponsoring next year and whether this number would go up or down. Most of our employers were employing apprentices, but on average, they were still only spending around about 33% of their levy, and that figure has not really gone up very much for a number of years. It seems to be difficult for employers to really spend the amount that government would like them to be spending on apprenticeships. So if we move on and look at the different groups, so let's start with graduates. There are sort of almost 20,000 graduates in this survey. A typical organisation is receiving about 60 applications for every vacancy they've got. The map shows how they're spread across the country, but I think importantly, around about a third of the organisations have reduced their planned graduate hiring in 2020. So what roles were they recruiting graduates for? Well, we've got a lot of different roles that they might have been recruiting graduates for, so IT, programmers, engineers, and so on. If we look at the ones that they found particularly difficult to recruit for, so this is the proportion of employers recruiting for each of those. These ones were ones that were highlighted by employers as being particularly difficult to recruit to. So IT programmers, engineers, technical and analytical roles, IT general roles, and accountancy and audit. Now, there were some employers who said some of the other roles were difficult, but these were the ones where I think at least a fifth said that they were having trouble recruiting each of these roles. So there are a number of areas where graduate employers are sort of struggling to recruit enough people. And as Stephen said, that's even in a situation where the labour market is quite sluggish from the student's point of view. Overall, we've seen quite a decline in graduate recruitment this year. So we've seen it go down by about 12%. And this little graph here shows you how that compares to other years. And essentially, we've seen the biggest decline in graduate recruitment since the sort of Great Recession, so the 2008-2009 cohort. I think what's will be important for us to pay attention to is that next year, in the equivalent point in the cycle, it started to bounce back fairly quickly. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. At the moment, it is looking like it's going to bounce back. So we asked a lot of our employers to give us an estimate of what they thought they would be recruiting in the 2020-21 cycle. And I've broken that down by sector here. So what we can see is the kind of proportion of change that different employers are describing. So as you can see, that between the amount that they were recruiting before the pandemic, so last year in the 2018-19 year, and we compare that to what they think they're going to be recruiting essentially this year in the 2020-21 cycle, we can see charity and public sector, health and pharmaceuticals, pretty stable, in fact, even going up a bit in the case of the public sector. Everyone else is expecting to recruit less. And in some sectors, and this is, I think, a really important feature of this recession that we're entering, is that it's very sectorally structured. Retail, fast-moving consumer goods, the built environment, actually, you'll see those coming up again and again. These seem to be the places where the recession is hitting most severely, really. So if we look at school and college leavers now, we can see similar sort of pattern, similar number of school and college leavers to the graduates being described here, but people are receiving less applications for each hire, only 39, but still a pretty competitive labour market there. And in this case, 51% of organisations reduced their planned school and college leaver hiring in 2020. But actually, we'll get on to looking at the pattern in recruitment in a second. But if we look at the roles that people are recruiting, they're organised a little bit differently for the school and college leavers. And the ones that people are finding difficult to recruit, actually very similar to the graduate ones. So IT programming, accountancy and audit, technical and analytical roles, skilled trades, and science and research. So these are, that's a kind of technician roles in this case. These are the things that people are finding difficult to recruit. So if we look, we haven't got as much data over a longer period from our surveys of how school and college leaver recruitment is changing. But what we can see is that this is one of the smaller increases in school and college leaver recruitment. But it's not actually in decline. So I mean, we were a little surprised by this because some of our earlier data we collected earlier in the year suggested that employers were moving away from apprenticeships and school and college leaver schemes. They seem to, by the end of the season, that seems to have rallied a bit. They seem to have recruited slightly more last year in 2019-20 than they did the previous year. So this is quite good news, but I wouldn't necessarily read it as being a general sort of trend in the economy that school and college leavers are better off than graduates. I mean, I think that it's well established that that is not the case, but with our employers, they're sticking with the school and college leaver targets that they had. If we look at how that plays out across sector, you've got much more of a kind of mixed picture here. Some sectors increasing their recruitment, others decreasing it. The legal sector, interestingly, decreasing it. Not a big recruiter of school and college leavers, but proportionately decreasing it. That's a trend we've seen actually over a number of years, may not be directly linked to the pandemic. We then move on to look at interns and placement students. So this is these short-term hires. This term intern can be used in quite a range of ways. When we're talking about interns, we're normally meaning short-term hires that are part of the graduate or part of the student experience in higher education. So perhaps a summer placement, an Easter placement, that kind of thing. When we're talking about placement students, we're really talking about longer placements, so a year in industry, a 9-month placement, that kind of thing. Now, placements and internships have been in much more dramatic decline than anything else. Again, probably not a big surprise. It's an easy thing. If you're going to cut something somewhere, it's an easy thing to cut, particularly short-term hires. If you can't bring people into the office and so on, it's an easier thing to cut. I think what we're also seeing is employers experimenting with quite a wide range of sort of replacements for this, so virtual internships of various kinds. But even despite that kind of creativity that we've seen going on, I think we've still got a sense that we've got a pretty big drop in the number of internships and placement students, and that's a little bit worrying. I wrote an article for Wonky over the last few days where we looked at what that might mean for universities, and obviously a lot of universities have really committed, and I think very rightly so, to the idea of building in some kind of placement to degrees. But if employers can't provide those placements anymore, that's going to create a number of problems for universities as well. So if we looked at the overall change in placement hiring, we can see some big changes here. So particularly, again, retail and fast-moving goods and built environment close to the bottom. Actually, the charity and public sector, again, not a big recruiter of interns and placements in comparison to the sort of standard graduate route, but have dropped off quite a bit there, perhaps focusing on graduates much more. But in fact, with the exception of the legal sector, where internships and placements are kind of more built in, I think all of the rest of the sectors have seen some kind of decline in the number of interns and placement hires that they're hiring or planning to hire next year in comparison to the pre-pandemic period. So if we look at the issue of attraction, so how do you actually get these students to actually apply for your different opportunities that you might have, whether it's graduates, school and college leavers, interns and placement students? We sort of know that some of these approaches to attraction have been changing quite a lot over the last few months, so we wanted to look at that a bit more. So there's quite a lot of information in this chart, so I'm just going to sort of break it down for you a little bit here. So what you can see is that the darker, the more green it is, the more positive it is, the more red it is, the more negative it is, essentially. So I think one of the questions that I've been really interested to ask people in recent years is, what do they find most effective? What's the best way, in this case, to attract students? And what we're seeing this year is that people are saying, actually, well, our company website, jobs boards of various kinds, social media marketing, they're our kind of most effective tools. And that's a bit different from previous years. It's unsurprisingly, everything has shifted very much online. People are identifying these as the top 3 things. The next one down is careers fairs, which they say, yeah, actually that can be quite an effective way to attract people. Some people were still using it in 2019, 2020. We would expect in 2020, 21, the number of firms that are engaging with face-to-face careers fairs will drop right off because people are not really going to be able to use that mechanism. And so they're telling us, yeah, actually, although that's effective, it's been stopped by COVID. And if we carry on working down, we can see that pattern, that we've got a number of things which are quite important to employers. So careers fairs, visits to universities, visits to schools and colleges, which have all been stopped to a great extent by COVID. And so one of the big questions that this poses, I think, is that the recruitment strategies, the attraction strategies that we're going to see in 2020, 21 are going to be different from those that we've seen in previous years. For the most part, 2019, 2020 kind of escaped from that because a lot of the attraction activities were done before the pandemic really hit, or at least people were only kind of mopping up after the pandemic hit. But I think if we're looking forward to this year, we're going to see some changes. We're going to see some of these face-to-face approaches disappearing. The big question is, will this be long-term? And I think from talking to employers, a lot of employers are telling me that actually, yes, it's quite likely that some of these things that we did in the past as face-to-face, we might either do less of or perhaps stop doing it all because they're too expensive or not effective enough. And even once we've got a vaccine, even once the pandemic is kind of over, assuming that it is. I think it's also interesting to look at some of the things that employers think are the least effective. So at the bottom, we've got things like producing a lot of printed materials, which I think probably a lot of us won't be too sad to see go. Using apprenticeship training providers to do the recruitment. I mean, certainly apprenticeship providers have been very beleaguered this year with the pandemic, but also some areas that I think, perhaps a little surprising. So contributing to the curriculum, which I think we would like to believe was an effective way to support students in their career learning, but perhaps is not delivering enough in terms of actually delivering candidates. And then we also see things like outsourcing recruitment is something which relatively few employers are convinced is very effective. So we've got a number of different findings here that hopefully will be useful about attraction. The other thing we asked was, in your attraction, are you specifically targeting any groups who, in terms of diversity? We've got a number of groups here, and it was clear that yes, many employers are. In fact, the overwhelming majority of employers are targeting some of their recruitment towards attracting particular groups. The kind of groups they were most likely to be doing that were looking for normally more women, so sex and gender. Sometimes it is more men, of course, depends on the industry, but also ethnicity. And I think there's been a particularly strong response to the Black Lives Matters movement, which has seen a lot of employers engaging with that very energetically, but also, substantial proportions of employers also having specific targets around socioeconomic background, disability, sexual orientation, and so on. They also talked a bit about how they were going about improving diversity. So we see a number of different strategies that we use. So targeting particular groups, that's what we've just sort of looked at in the previous slide. Actively kind of, sending marketing materials, actively targeting those groups, one of the most popular ones. Changing the universities that were visited, again, another action that is probably quite effective in terms of improving diversity. Tailoring marketing materials, ensuring diverse campus representatives, and running outreach events. So these are the kind of main strategies that people are using. That we've got each of those. There's more than a third of employers using these as a way to try and increase their diversity. So we've hopefully been out, we've attracted lots of students through these new mechanisms of doing lots of things online. We hopefully have got a more diverse pool of employees. So how do we select them? So let's look at selection. Well, one of the first things that's worth talking about is the idea of minimum requirements, which over recent years is something we've talked about quite a lot. A lot of employers seem to, or an increasing number of employers seem to be moving away from the idea of academic focused recruitment targets. So focusing on 2-1 degrees or A levels as their kind of main approach to setting minimum requirements. In fact, what we've found is that that this year that started to tail off, so the reduction in those numbers. And there's a good reason, I think, for some employers to not base things on minimum requirements. If we base things on minimum requirements, we're kind of basing things on the performance in the academic system, which tends to favour more advantaged candidates, and it may not tell us that much about someone's performance in job. But so that kind of case for social mobility has been made over a number of years. I think this year we've seen that drop off a bit, and actually people kind of going back to the idea of focusing on academic requirements rather than various other forms. But we'll see. I mean, it's only really 1 year where that trend has changed, so we'll see what happens next year as well. So if we look in a bit more detail at people's recruitment approach, selection approaches that they're using, again, quite a lot of information on this, similar to the chart I showed you with the attraction. What we did here, based on some feedback that we had from some members based on the way we looked at it last year, was we've divided out what's effective in the first stage as a way of kind of winnowing this field down, and then finally what's effective to make your final decision. Who do you actually appoint? And what we can see is quite a kind of clear pattern here, that in the first stage people think these things are the most appealing. So psychometric testing, CV screening, interestingly assessment centres, but also automated interviews. Now, I'm not sure about why assessment centres are in there. I don't think that many employers actually do use assessment centres genuinely as the first stage of their recruitment. And most of the other things that are in here are really things which are designed to deal with mass systems. So to deal with, psychometric tests are good. You can put as many people as you want through that, and then you can use that to select people. Same with CV screening. Automated interviews, another technique for doing that that's using some new technologies. But how do you go about then making your final decision? What's most effective? Well, again, we've got this idea of assessment centres being really critical, and that really comes out, and it came out very strongly last year. So online and face-to-face, and then interviews, both face-to-face and online. These are the things that people think are the best things for making a final decision. But if we look across, those face-to-face assessment centres and interviews are also the things that are most likely to be stopped by COVID. So they're causing a problem, which means that people have shifted to the online approach, even though perhaps the online approach is not. People don't believe it's quite as effective. They generally, almost as many people believe it's effective as they do with the face-to-face versions, but they would probably rather be doing the face-to-face. But because COVID's stopping that, we've seen the processes shifting online. And this is really, I think, the pattern that we've seen. And the selection phase of recruitment, I think, was much more substantially disrupted by COVID this year. And so a lot of the work in shifting this stuff online has probably gone a bit further than some of the attraction, the similar work with attraction. So we've seen lots of firms now using online interviewing, using online assessment centres, increasing their reliance on various kinds of testing and screening, which are more automated testing and screening. So again, we've got the question, in the long run, will this switch back? From talking to employers, it seems to me quite likely that this is not just a temporary shift. In many ways, it exacerbates tendencies that were already apparent in the industry before COVID. So we're seeing, this shift towards more stuff online, more stuff automated, more lower cost forms of recruitment and selection. Again, we asked about diversity, and if we look at the approaches that various employers were using in order to improve diversity, we've got some of the most popular ones. More than half of employers were analysing the diversity outcomes of previous campaigns carefully to inform how they did things in the future. More than half were offering diversity monitoring as part of their recruitment process, and more than half were offering diversity and unconscious bias training. Almost half are trying to engage more diverse assessor groups. Again, it's interesting to look at some of the things that are at the bottom, which tend to be sort of somewhat more structural things. So, for example, we've got things, I mean, we've got various things here, but I think particularly things like university blind recruitment, reordering or simplifying selection stages, name blind recruitment. These things are being done by much less or much fewer employers, and I think we've got some evidence to suggest they might be quite effective techniques. So, but there's certainly a lot of evidence of activity around reforming and rethinking diversity processes, rethinking recruitment processes. So we've then got a section where we look at the actual process of hiring, and so the first thing is, do employers fill their positions? Pretty much all employers said yes, we were able to fill pretty much all of the positions we wanted to fill last year. When they're offered, do graduates and school leavers accept the positions they're offered? Yes, pretty much they do. They're pretty happy. So the overwhelming majority of people of graduates were accepting, and school and college leavers were accepting the positions that they were offered. Finally, we'll have a little bit of a look at salaries. So we've got some information about salaries. So I've given the median salary and then the low and the high. So we've got the range here. So graduates, the typical graduate salary that was on offer from one of our members was around just below £30,000 a year. So pretty high salary. But the salaries on offer range between 20,000 and 50,000. School and college leavers, there was a range between 10,000, around about 10,000 and 28,000, but their median, the typical salary that was being offered was just below 20,000. Similar typical salary for interns and placement students. And there we had a range between nothing, so the unpaid internships that we're hearing about, very, very uncommon amongst our membership. I think there was actually only one of our members who offers an unpaid internship, and we're not very keen on it at the ISE. But at the other end of that, some people are offering incredibly well-paid internships, so essentially putting them on similar salaries to graduates. And mostly, as you can see, mostly it was much lower and more similar to the school and college leavers that students are being offered for these interns and placement students positions. Okay, so let's look at how salaries have changed over time. And what we can see is pretty steady progress upwards. There's a, very, graduates gone from earning just slightly over 20,000 in 2003 to just under 30,000 now. But this can be a bit misleading because if we actually adjust for inflation, so we'll link it to the consumer price index, what we can see is actually all of these salaries have been really very, very flat. So pretty much if you were graduating in 2003, the amount of money that you were paid would buy you pretty much as much stuff as it would do now. Now, in a period of boom, we would expect salaries to go up, the real buying power of salaries to go up a bit, and we see that before 2008, we see that going up a bit. But once we look at the period when we had the recession, so 2007, 2008, 2009, we see that at that point salaries start to fall off on all of these, and we see the sort of bump of what would have been an upward trend drop down, and then pretty much salaries stay very, very stable. Sadly, I think we would certainly entertain the possibility that the real buying power of your salary might go down over the next few years if we go back into recession. So that's something that we'll be watching quite closely. It doesn't really seem to be happening yet in a way that's very apparent. So we'll see about that. Okay, let's look forward a little bit into the future and say a bit more about that. So we asked our employers to say, well, how do they think the next 5 years are going to go? So when we're talking about the future, that's the window that we're giving people. So the first thing is, do you think you need to focus more on diversity? Which type of diversity would you need to focus on more in order to achieve a more kind of diverse workforce? Pretty much it echoes where people's targets are, sex and gender, race being the most kind of popular ones, socioeconomic background, again, important, disability important, and so on. We then asked about skills. What skills do you think students are going to need over the next 5 years? Well, overwhelmingly, and I think this is, perhaps a little worrying because of what it really says about how employers are imagining the labour market might go. What it tells us is that resilience is going to be one of the things that people are going to look for. People are expecting that we're going to have some hard times, and that students who are resilient, who can cope with the knockbacks, are going to be really, really important. Now, resilience is something employers always want, but they certainly want it to a greater degree. They think it's one of the most important ones at the moment. But they also want emotional intelligence. They want the capacity for remote working. They think that's going to become increasingly important. And there's some evidence that employers are considering shifting more of their workforce into a more kind of agile or remote working approach. And then obviously IT and digital skills, which typically comes up in these kinds of lists, and data handling and data analysis. So they were the top in-demand skills that employers were thinking are going to become more important over the next 5 years. Now, actually, there wasn't a lot of evidence that employers were very worried that any particular roles would become a lot more difficult to hire. And really, the ones that score most highly are the ones that people are already finding difficult to hire. So the IT roles, the engineering, the technical roles. And so this is sort of, I think, important because it gives us some clues about where employers are seeing some of these difficulties. Finally, I think we asked, some big political issues. What do you think will lead to actually you recruiting less students? And the big issue is economic recession. Obviously, if we go into recession, most employers would expect they would recruit less students, and very much intertwined with that is the issue of COVID. Now, much more popular as an answer to this last year was the issue of Brexit, but it's still in there somewhere. And then we get to some of these more perhaps slightly abstract issues that we often talk about, so artificial intelligence, automation, technological change. Again, people are worried about them. Some are worried about them, not most by any sense. Nobody's very worried about change of government. Well, that might be the period that we've given people to look at. I mean, over 5 years, we're probably quite a long way away from a change of government if there's going to be one. Less young people is not a big worry for people. Gig economy, Scottish independence, I keep putting this in, but very few employers are particularly worried about it, even though it's not at all impossible that this might happen over the next few years. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the research that we've done, of some of the data that we've presented for you. I think hopefully some of it you'll find pretty interesting, and I'm happy to answer some questions on it. Hopefully, perhaps dig a little bit more into some of these things, speculate on what some of it means. But really, some of the best ways for you to get access to this is to go online and have a look at our publications. Obviously, you can only do that if you're an ISE member. So if you're listening to this and you're not an ISE member, then I'd really encourage you to join, or your organisation to join. And there's a lot more data in there, and we'll also find lots of ways to give you access to more of this data as we do further analysis through the year. So This is me. If you're interested in finding out, getting in touch, please get in touch. But otherwise, let's take some questions if we've got any.
We have, Tristram. Thanks for that. It's a really insightful presentation. That's distilling a lot of pages into one of the slides. I've had a couple of people have asked about being able to get a copy of the slides. So two things. One is this webinar is recorded, and all of those of you that are registered will get a link to the recording. Also, if you're an ISE member, you'll be able to access this via the website as well. Later on today, it just takes a little while for the platform we use to sort of do its magic and download it. We also, on our members area of the website, we have got a slide repository, because quite often Tristram and I get asked for copies of our slides, or people want to use various bits of slides so they can drop them into their own decks, whether it's for dealing with stakeholders in your organisation, working with students. So yes, we will put the slides there as well. So we've got a few questions. Let's get straight in there. So the first one, Tristram, I had from Tom when you were talking about graduate visa, the new regulations coming into effect, and it being, a two-year visa for international students. And Tom was wondering that actually wondering about employers, and do we know how employers are likely to respond to the new visa regulations, whether it will be positive or not? I've got my own thoughts, which I'll probably add on afterwards. But what have you been hearing, Tristram?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion. That's what the data tells us. There's a lot of confusion. People, we're saying almost half, the 40% or so of employers are recruiting international students and are sponsoring these opportunities. But actually, looking forward, the overwhelming majority don't know what they're going to do. So I think people are still really watching and seeing. I think there would be an appetite for recruiting international students, but it does very much depend on how difficult and complex the process is. So I think there's a lot of wait and see here.
Yes, I think that's true. And also talking to a lot of employers, the rules around visas can be very complicated and expensive to administer as well. So that's also something to bear in mind as people try to get their heads around it. I mean, we've always been very supportive that the rules around visas should be changed. It was something that we put in our manifestos and spoke out on quite a bit. So it is definitely a good step. I do think we should be a little bit cautious, though, that employers are immediately going to open, the floodgates and wanting more and more international students. We've been talking about the number of vacancies there are in the market, issues around student unemployment. The also reality is for many employers, although the visa may allow somebody to stay for 2 years, if I go back to my own experience in professional services, actually the training contract lasted 3 years. The other thing was that actually even for shorter programs, quite often you're hiring graduates for the long term. So to hire somebody when in 2 years' time, you may not be able to get them a visa, you've got that level of uncertainty, again, might put employers off. So if I go back to my own experience, we always used to get full visas for the international students we hired. We weren't really interested in the temporary short-term visas. But having said that, there's a whole bunch of, we're generalizing about employers, employers that international mobility is high on their priority list. It's very useful for them and all sorts of other reasons. And some employers do have positions whereby, yes, they just want a graduate for a year or two, and this serves very well for them. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, but something that we definitely need to do more on. This is more a comment, Tristram, than a question, but I wondered if it's one worth noting for the future. So John mentioned saying it'd be great to see care leavers or care experienced people on the diversity target slide. He was saying that civil service have a program dedicated to this specific group. So maybe that's something we should think about for the future.
Yeah, we've kind of gradually been expanding that list, but I mean, I suppose really we try and be led by what employers are actually doing. But yeah, I mean, we've added in recent years, we've added the sort of transgender as an issue. We've added neurodiversity as an issue. I think absolutely right. I mean, there's many other sort of protected characteristics that we could look at, and I mean, I would have no problem. I suspect at the moment very few employers have got a specific agenda around care leavers, and that if they have, it will be sort of buried into their socioeconomic category. But yeah, absolutely happy to look at it more.
Cool. And a question from Giannina, I hope I pronounced that right, Giannina, talking about unpaid internships. So, and also just about what the ISE stands on unpaid internships. I've often thought we don't really get much data on unpaid internship because our sort of base very much pays for interns.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very rare for one of our members to run unpaid internships. I mean, there was one this year, one firm that did do it. I mean, if we dig into that more, it may be an issue around category, because I think our policy would be that anything over about 2 weeks worth of work experience, that really employers should be paying students, and that's the right thing to do. And I think if you look at where some of those more unpaid internships happen, they're not generally happening so much in the big firms who tend to be ISE members, but they might be in areas like arts. Some of the arts internships are unpaid. Some of the some SME internships are unpaid. Also, interestingly, given how politicians discuss this, if you're interning for a politician or a political party, you're very likely to be unpaid. And so I often think they might want to put their own house in order. But yeah, I mean, I think we are pretty clear that we're not a great fan of unpaid internships, and that most of our employers don't really use them.
Yeah, so yeah, that is very much our stance. And also, we when this does come up, we definitely try to educate employers, saying that actually, well, if you pay, you get a better quality of intern, because it is a competitive market, and also it does your reputation a lot more good on campus. There's all sorts of reason for interns, and I think it'd be interesting, won't it, Tristram, to see how that pans out over the next 12 months, because of course intern programs typically are such a strong feeder for graduate jobs, and most employers have always told us that their interns tend to make better hires. They're more likely to accept job offers, and they stay longer when they do join.
Yeah, about 50% of the people that our employers bring in as interns or placement students, they then rehire them. So it's a pretty important strand of people's recruitment. It's also a pretty good opportunity. If as a student you manage to get an internship, you're very likely to then go on to get a good job. So if those decline, it is a bit of a worry. And I mean, partly because many firms have also used internships as a kind of way of addressing some of their diversity issues as well. It's a kind of a route where they can bring people in the short term to give them some more experience. So yeah, if that collapses, then that's going to be a problem. And equally, it's very possible that if we've got a lot more graduates or school leavers sitting around without anything to do, that they'll be sort of prey to more unpaid internships, which I think ultimately is not a sort of particularly sustainable way for the economy to grow again.
Sort of a question straight comment here from Suzanne, who said she's surprised to hear that accounting is hard to recruit for, given how many people apply to the bigger accountancy firms that make up part of our membership. Do you have any thoughts on that, why that might be, Tristram?
Well, I think probably people in the accountancy area will be more a better place to talk about the details of it. I mean, my guess is that people who are recruiting to the accountancy firms are recruiting often in very similar pools to those who are recruiting for those other areas that I highlighted as shortage areas. So the computer scientists, maybe not so much the engineers, although to some extent the engineers, but the technical and analytical roles. So if you're going out and you're looking for high numeracy graduates, then you're fishing in a pool that everybody is saying is not quite big enough. And so my guess is that it's to do with that, rather than because, for example, accountancy is not popular. I think it's just that the kind of caliber of and the background of graduates that people are looking for is probably is quite highly competitive.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned tech as well, because Carla's made a comment that her organisation is looking to do more recruitment by the way of data analysts, etc. So she's interested to hear from others about why they find them difficult to fill those roles. I mean, I also think I remember somebody telling me, PwC telling me, saying that we don't talk about preference enough in our market. And again, I know from my experience that sometimes those roles aren't necessarily hard to fill in London. You know, if you're recruiting people to work in the city of London, accountancy roles, etc., you get plenty of vacancies for those. But actually, when you add maybe a layer of regionality, you know, again, if I go back to my days, you know, in the Big Four, places like, you know, Reading, those sort of places on the periphery of London were quite hard to recruit to because everybody wanted to come into the centre of London. So I think there's something around location as well as the technical skill level might have a part to play. I know it definitely used to be there.
I mean, there's a bit more data in the report which talks about why people don't like some of these roles, or why some of these roles are more difficult to recruit to. And you know, one of the reasons is geographical location. I think that's probably more of an issue for some of, say, the engineering roles than it is for some of the IT roles. But it's but another one is, as you say, is preference. It's that people don't fancy doing this kind of work, essentially. So there's quite a range of reasons. We go into that in a little bit more detail there. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately there is a level of supply and demand here, and you can see there's a pretty clear pattern in the jobs that tend to, I mean, not just this year, but every year tend to appear at the top of that list, which is which ones are difficult to recruit to. And they tend to be all of these more high numeracy, more technical kind of roles where there's just perhaps not quite enough graduates. I mean, most of our employers say ultimately they do manage to fill these, but yeah, they find them harder to fill.
A question from Chris on academic requirements, actually. So he was talking about your slide that showed around 60% of employers asked for A levels, but he was wondering actually if you had any analysis on actually what grade they're after. You know, is it sort of a minimum set of A levels, particular number of UCAS points, etc.?
No, I mean, what we're asking at a fairly high level there, and really what I think I'm interested in, and what I remember giving an interview to a newspaper or something a couple of years ago, and I said that I thought that this trend of relying on academic requirements was pretty much in decline, and essentially different employers do that in different ways. Some of them basically base it on degrees, and others basically base it on A levels. But essentially, what you're saying is that we trust what schools and universities are turning out to be a good indicator of of who might be good at doing these jobs. And I would have said a couple of years ago that I thought that was a trend that was kind of dying out, and that people would, you know, if we look forward 10 years into the future, that people will be relying much more on sort of psychometrics and their own testing and assessment centres and so on. This year, that seems to have gone back a bit. It might be a bit pandemic related. It could be a bit that people are struggling to do as much precise stuff as they were able to do when they were able to do assessment centres and so on. So they're leaning back into more traditional ways of doing things. But I think you know, I don't really know. It may be equally that that trend that we saw has peaked, and that people who were worried about that, you know, that's a you know, fifth of employers who are very worried about those kinds of issues, but maybe everyone else is not so worried. So we'll kind of see how that will be one that we're watching quite closely.
And of course, how COVID impacts that, and you know, we're hearing about, you know, Wales not holding exams. There's of course the you know, the huge amounts of uncertainty around how grades are actually awarded. So I wonder if that actual uncertainty might cause more employers to think, actually, you know what, we won't look at them in detail.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we've got. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, where we've got odd results this year, where we've got results that kind of run against trends, you know, it's not surprising, is it? Because this has been a very unusual year. It doesn't necessarily mean that longer term trends will disappear altogether. It may well be that over the next few years we reset back to what the trend was before. That we'll have to see though.
A question here from John, talking about the number of employers participating in Kickstart at 11%. You any thoughts on whether that's above or below expectations, or is it just a little bit too early to tell at the moment?
I think it's probably a bit below expectations. I mean, certainly given the way Kickstart's set up, if you can't convince our members to engage in it, you're probably going to struggle to convince very many people. In that our members are big firms, you have to be of a certain size to participate in Kickstart, or at least easily to participate in Kickstart. There are also firms that regularly are bringing in lots of young people, and so Kickstart could have been a sort of try before you buy scheme for apprenticeships, for example. I think the government will probably be disappointed with that. I don't think it's a done deal yet, though. I think there's a lot, employers have got a lot on their plates. It may well be that this situation develops and that things change a bit more over the next few months. And also, as Kickstart itself gets a bit more established, the kind of comms around it become a bit clearer, all of that sort of thing, it may well help. I mean, I think we'd probably expect that to go up, but at the moment, it looks like a lot of our employers are staying away from it for now.
And a question from Karen, and she's wondering whether actually you've come across an increase in employers who are deferring offers. So I think that's referring to employers that maybe weren't able to bring all their graduates in this year as originally planned, then deferring some of those offers to next year.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have heard about that anecdotally, that people, I mean, so in the last report we did, we talked a bit about, I mean, it wasn't the full 1 year deferrals, but sort of delayed start dates and things like that. So some employers we know definitely have pushed back start dates from September through to, say, January or February. But no, I mean, we haven't picked that up as a big trend. I mean, we didn't exactly ask that question, but yeah, I don't think there's going to be a major sort of trend where employers start recruiting loads of people and then just telling them don't turn up for another year. I'm not sure how practical that is. But yeah, so I think that's probably a bit on the fringes and more deferring for a little while.
Yeah, something that was definitely a feature of the financial crash. I've heard a lot less about it this time around. There was definitely more talk around that, particularly in the finance and banking sector 10 years ago. But yeah, like you, I've heard about it occasionally, but not in any meaningful way, not like back then. Another question actually also from Karen, asking about T-levels. So are you seeing employers starting to engage with T-levels yet?
Well, I mean, T-levels don't or only just about exist. So I didn't ask a question about that this year. I think we probably will do next year. But I mean, at the moment, T-levels are only just being started to roll out. And so the first students will only have gone on to the first T-level programs this September. So I think probably the employer engagement side of it is not a big issue yet, but I think it will come. And I think if government sticks with T-levels as a route, and I think there's quite a lot to be commended about them as a route, then it will require employers to pick it up. And the worry, I think, would be that if employers are kind of backing away from things like placements and internships, and if they're not very excited by Kickstart, how enthusiastic will they be about bringing in 16, 17-year-olds for very short placements? I think it may be that the current environment is not the best place for that, but I mean, yeah, we'll see. And I think I'll be really interested to hear when people start doing evaluations of the T-levels, how that's working out.
And there's a lot of T-levels. When T-levels come online, probably there's a lot of placements that the government are aiming for, which also makes me nervous just around that general expectation level. It might be a little bit unrealistic. A question here from Lee Tristram. Lee was quite surprised that talks and workshops visits to universities seem to be rated a bit lower in effectiveness. I guess this is kind of go back to pre-COVID activities. But Lee wondered whether does this already refer to employers that are repositioning their strategy going forward because of COVID, or is it a kind of a long-term thing around what employers saying work or don't work.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a bit surprised by that, but it was kind of, I mean, it does fit with the pattern that we had last year. So last year was the first time we really asked this question about effectiveness rather than just what people are doing. And people people thought a lot of things were effective that I wouldn't have necessarily guessed being. And so really the pattern is that things that don't cost a lot, that you can kind of do and have a sort of wide impact, but not necessarily a deep one. Quite a lot of employers actually say, well, they're a bit more effective, you know, they're quite effective actually. So that thing of sticking something on your website, I mean, it costs you nothing. You know, if it generates a decent number of applications, then you can quite fairly say it was very, very effective. Whereas, you know, running up the M1 with a car full of leaflets and banners and so on, you know, it costs you quite a lot in time, in energy, in thinking about how it works. It may be that at the end of that you don't generate very many applications at all. So I think that is something that and I think that problem sort of does transfer online as well, is that if sort of deeper engagements with universities and schools and colleges don't generate some applications or a decent number of applications, then employers I think have got some reason to feel that it's not hitting their kind of primary purpose. It might serve other purposes. It might be useful corporate social responsibility. It might be long-term relationship building. But in terms of actually generating kind of applications, it may be that some of those deeper things aren't really as effective as we might like to believe.
Cool. Got a question here from Lee, actually, talking about this move from minimum requirements that has been a long-term trend. I mean, I would think the answer to what he's asking is yes, but is it about, that's an indication of employers making a greater focus on transferable skills and or greater alignment with culture and values, etc., of an organisation? I would guess the answer to that is yes. If you're not putting as much focus on academic credentialism, it's something else, in a sense, will have greater weight to take its place.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I would have said the trend was that yeah, people were spending more time thinking about what exactly it was that made you successful in the job that you were applying for, and then they were testing you for whatever that was, and whether that's, you know, teamwork, which it might be in some jobs, or whether that's C+ programming or whatever, which it might be in other jobs. The focus was shifting towards the kind of testing of those capabilities. I think, you know, I'm not sure the last year has seen that go on. So I think, you know, people are still, academic qualifications are still very important, and employers are not showing that they're about to abandon a kind of reliance on academic qualifications, I think we'd have to say.
Got you. I'm just conscious, if you're watching this and you see me, I'm not staring out the window ignoring you, Tristram. I'm looking at the questions on my monitor, which are up and to the left. So I'm just distracting myself from the question that I was reading and about to put to you. Yeah, so a question here from Doreen talking about CV submissions and employers saying that they're a good first stage recruitment strategy. And wondering that actually, will this continue in popularity given that it's difficulties with diversity, etc., etc. I mean, I often thought that CVs aren't really that significant when it comes to our employer members, but I guess they need that initial information to act off, whether they choose to blank out academic data, you know, people's personal data. They're still going to be there, aren't they? I guess. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tristram?
Yeah, I might have to have another look at how we ask those questions, because I'm not sure we're really distinguishing between CVs and sort of online application forms, which essentially are taking the same information in a different format. I mean, that's, yeah, my experience is that most employers are now wanting that sort of CV information to be entered into a data entry form that's more like an online application. So I think that's right. But in terms of how you go about, what I think they're telling us is that that basic information about who you are, what degree you've got, what things you're interested in, that is a very important and effective initial sifting technique. And I suspect if you looked across different employers, they would collect that information in somewhat different ways depending on who you were talking to.
Question here from John, different John this time, talking about whether we've seen that employers, as a long-term trend, but also as a result of COVID and using many more online tools, actually looking at prioritising working with students that have a more diverse population, maybe aren't quite the usual suspects that they always go to, and targeting, you know, widely participation institutions more so than they were in the past.
So, like, on one level, yes, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, if I ask a question about diversity, everyone agrees to some extent with it. If you look at the things they're then doing about that decision about, for example, going to other different set of universities, which, like, particularly if you're worried about ethnicity and socioeconomic background, then shifting the universities that you're recruiting from is a very good strategy to try and change that. And, you know, I often talk to members about this when people will say, you know, which universities have the most students from this kind of background, and you can usually find that information out fairly easily. But actually, the number of people who are saying that that's one of the things they've changed about their attraction is not as high as some of the other things that people are doing. So I think that's definitely true. Employers definitely care about diversity. Unlearning some of the ways that we've traditionally recruited and shifting towards recruiting to, for example, post-92 institutions is something that I think it's there, definitely is an important strategy, but it's not the majority, I don't think, yet.
Just one more question, then I think we're done, Tristram. So question around minimum A-level requirements when we were talking about A-levels. I assume that also does include A-level equivalents. So when employers talk about A-levels, they also very much talk about, you know, equivalents to A-level grades.
Yeah, it's A-level / UCAS points on the question. Yeah, so it's. I mean, you know, of course, there is a question about how people react to things like BTECs, and that will become even more important when we look at T-levels more in the future, and whether people do really see them as equivalent to A-levels. But yeah, in general, I think we're you know, some employers will be looking specifically, others will be looking at more like point equivalents. You've got to get past this threshold in order to be able to apply, and that should cover it, all of the different types of qualifications that are at that level 3 level.
Thanks, Tristan. Really great insights as ever. Just a couple of comments that I'll pass on. One from Nick at Fujitsu. So Nick said the interesting thing about T-levels is, of course, that placements needs to take place face-to-face, which is very difficult for many employers to comment right now. So that's obviously going to be a pressure. Another comment from Karen at Deloitte, who says, yes, accountancy, some locations are very difficult to fill. So that's obviously still an issue in that sector. I used to have to recruit, because remember, accountancy also cover things like tax, and we used to have to recruit people to do tax in Inverness, which was a problem year in, year out, whatever the economy. So that's great. Really good set of questions there, and thanks for the insights, Tristram. And you're going to be taking part in our various employer sector town halls and other webinars and online events that we'll be doing. Is that right? So we'll be able to do this in quite a bit more detail over the coming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, a lot of it's in the report. There's a lot more detail in the report, but yeah, I'll be certainly mining it for more information for different sector groups. Yeah, and if people have got specific questions, then please just send them to me. But great, thank you. It's been, yeah, a lot of interesting things to keep us on our feet there. So.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much for Tristram. Thank you again to all those employers who gave us their data. As I said at the start, you know, we really can't produce this kind of analysis without your time and effort completing this. So thank you very much for that. Do check the website for upcoming events. So I mentioned employer sector groups. We've got a whole range of other events that we do online where we will be going into this data in more detail, and also for, you know, where it is relevant, where we've got sector breakdowns. All of you that registered for this webinar, you will get a link later on today with the recording of this webinar. So please do feel free to share it amongst your peers. We're keen to get this data analysis out as much as possible. And also we will pop the slides on to our website, so you can have a look at those at your leisure and use them if you need to. So I think that's all from us now. Thank you very much for logging in. We had about 230 logged on at one point, so we've had a really good turnout today. So if you've got any questions, then you know where we are. Please get in touch. We'll be more than happy to answer. Enjoy the rest of your day. Tristram, thanks everybody.